It's time for another episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show, a podcast where I connect you with thought leaders from across the globe, digging into some of my favorite topics like personal development, marketing, spirituality, and pretty much any other shiny object that happens to catch my attention. Today, my special guest is Clint Burnett, and we're going to be discussing his new book, Studying the New Testament Through Inscriptions, an Introduction. Clint, it is truly an honor, sir. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Well, I'm glad we finally made this happen. We've been going back and forth, and I think I just packed my days way too tight. But here we are, finally getting to dive into your new book. This is the first time you and I are meeting. I know you're going to be brand new to my viewers and my listeners. So we're going to kick this off by having you share a bit of the Clint Burnett origin story. Feel free to share your superpowers, your special abilities, everything we need to know about you. Share that with us now.
Okay. Well, I was born and raised in South Carolina. I lived there my whole life until I became a Christian and got introduced to this amazing, strange book called the Bible. And from there, I wanted to learn more about it. And so I went to college in West Tennessee and earned a bachelor's in Bible. And then as I was earning my bachelor's in Bible, it dawned on me that people actually uh, make a living or actually spend their life studying this professionally and writing commentaries and books. And I said, well, that sounds fun. I don't want to do that. And so then I started to do everything that I needed to do in order to make that happen. And along the way, I was able to meet my beautiful wife, Jerry Lynn Burnett. She's my superpower. She was actually, she competes in strongman competitions, or hasn't in a while, but she wants to. And she was at one point in time Massachusetts' strongest woman while we were up in Boston, while I did my PhD at Boston College. And so that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
Well, if your wife has competed in that sort of competition, she deserves the cape and the superhero designation. Works very well. And what husband doesn't think their wife is a superhero? We all couldn't do what we do without a great woman behind us being on the journey with us. In terms of your academic background, you said you went to Bible college. Was there a specific specialization or direction that you chose to go along that journey?
So when I first got to college, all I wanted was to just to be a pastor. I wanted just to help people better understand the Bible. And then the more I understood about the Bible, the more I realized the more I didn't know about the Bible. And so I figured out what's the best way for me to learn the most I can. And so I became fascinated with sort of the world in which the Bible was written. I'm a firm believer that context determines the meaning of everything. And so I wanted specifically to focus more on the context of the first Christians, to get inside their thought world, what I like to call the cultural encyclopedia of their day, you know, their likes, their dislikes, their belief systems, value systems, everything that was part of the Greco-Roman world in which the first Christians lived. And so I began to take classes around those research interests while I was doing my Master of Divinity. I was blessed to be able to do a Master of Sacred Theology at Boston University and focus mainly on that topic. And then I was blessed to be able to focus on that and my PhD in Boston College. And I was really nurtured and just allowed to kind of carve my own niche and figure out those areas of the study of mainly the Pauline epistles and Acts of the Apostles that I wanted to pursue. And along the way, I realized if you want to really get into the cultural encyclopedia, you need to go excavate. So for 4 or 5 years, I began to go over to Israel and 2 years in Cyprus, just visiting, excavating on sites, just getting to know literally the material culture that we pulled out of the ground of the world of the first Christians. And so it was very formative, and that forms a background of everything that I do, just to try to use all that material to illuminate mainly Paul's epistles and Acts of the Apostles, but the Gospels as well.
And in terms of like language study to be competent to talk about inscriptions, was a lot of your focus on Greek, or what was the range of language you studied during your education?
Yeah, so Greek was the first thing that I learned. One of the reasons that I even pursued a PhD is because of my first Greek teacher at college. You just made the comment that, you know, when you teach your students Greek, and I said, okay, I can teach Greek, but I needed to learn a lot before I could do that. But that was very formative to a young man who was trying to be like a sponge and soak everything up. I mainly focused on, I got a minor in biblical languages while I was doing my undergraduate degree. So that was 4 semesters of Greek and 2 semesters of Hebrew. and then continued on to my Master of Divinity, focusing mainly on Greek, but also Hebrew. And then when I got to my PhD program, we did some Aramaic and along the way Latin as well, because most people, I mean, since the New Testament is written in Greek, and since the documents that make up the Old Testament were translated into Greek, most New Testament scholars focus on Greek. But the people that were in charge of the world in which the first Christians lived, they spoke Latin, and their official communications were in Latin. So I figured that if I really wanted to get into that world, I needed to learn that particular language. So that's when I picked up along the way as well.
And you may not remember this, but I'm always curious uh, to hear from somebody who's kind of come up educationally how you have. What grammars did you first learn with for Greek and Hebrew?
Yeah. So David Allen Black for my first Greek class. That was Greek 1 and 2, and then David Allen Black. I think it's still Greek to me, or the
Hmm.
second volume. Daniel B. Wallace, Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics. Those were my main texts. I still think those are three of the best Greek grammars to use. I think Daniel B. Wallace's Greek Grammar Beyond the Basics, I think it's up there with some of Blasterbrunner and Funk and all those. I think it's the easiest to read. I actually read it from cover to cover one time, and you could do that. I mean, it's a magnificent piece of work and scholarship for which I'm very appreciative. Um, Ross for I forgot his first name, but Ross's Hebrew grammar, and then Sayal's Hebrew grammar, and then hang on, I'm trying to think of. There's another one, Walton, that is more advanced Hebrew grammar, and I forgot the last name. There's two names,
Sure.
but it's a fantastic advanced Hebrew grammar.
Well, like I said, I'm always curious. You can kind of date when somebody went to school, sort of based on the grammars they use. I learned Greek with Machen, so
Ah,
that's very old school. Lots of memorization. It does not read nearly as well as some of the more modern grammars. And then Weingren for Hebrew, which is
okay.
also extremely old school and hardcore. Very different methodology of learning in both of those grammars compared to some of the more recent or contemporary grammars. And so, yes, Machen and Weingren. That's where I got to cut my teeth. So, let's transition now, talking about why the study of inscriptions is important. I think for the average person in the pew, or the average person attending church on Zoom might be more appropriate for the season we've been in. I feel like we don't often think about inscriptions or why they might be important. Maybe the closest context somebody will get is seeing something in a museum or in a picture in an encyclopedia. But we don't often think about the value of why those might be important. So, just at the 100,000 foot level, why is the study of scripture, or excuse me, inscriptions, significant and important?
Yeah. So first off, inscriptions would be a message that was engraved, scratched, or written, most often on stone, but also there are other materials on which it's found, even bone, which is kind of creepy. But some were written on bone. The reason they're important is, or there are several. The most important one for me is that the New Testament demands we as readers have a knowledge. All four gospels talk about this thing that was placed above the head of Jesus on the cross, called an inscription. According to the Gospel of John, it was written in Latin, Aramaic, and Greek. Paul uses an inscription in Acts chapter 17, what would be called a votive inscription, an inscription that was on an altar dedicated to an unknown God, as sort of the starting point to launch into a sermon about the nature of God and the day of judgment that is impending. And then Paul himself in Second Corinthians talks about the old covenant and likens it to the Ten Commandments being engraved on stone. And then all throughout the book of Revelation, most people don't realize there are inscriptions on a lot of things, especially in the New Jerusalem and in the new heaven and the new earth. And so that's the first thing that really we as readers of the New Testament demands that we understand. The second reason inscriptions are important is they are direct witnesses of the past. All the documents that we have that are Greco-Roman literature, including the Bible, comes down to us through the use of scribes copying these documents over and over. But when we look at an inscription, we're actually seeing what a stonecutter actually did at sometimes contemporary to the first century Christianity. And the third reason would be that they're just so diverse because there's so many of them. Now, epigraphers, these would be people who study inscriptions professionally, who specialize in them. I'm not an epigrapher, I just use the work of epigraphers. But they estimate there's anywhere between 500,000 and 800,000 surviving inscriptions. So that just blows your mind if you think about it. And that's only a fraction of actually what existed. And so the cities in which Christianity was established in the first century was jam-packed with inscriptions. Funerary inscriptions would line the roads outside cities where the dead were buried in what's called necropolises. Inside, you would see inscriptions that would be set up in the marketplaces. They would be set up near temples, in front of the doors of temples, inside the sacred boundaries of temples. They would be set up everywhere. And so it was something that was just part of the world in which the first Christians lived and moved and had their being, if you want to think about it like that. And the last reason, the reason that I think they're so important, is they're contextual documents. I mean, what I mean by that is they're written by a particular person, or they're produced by particular people at a particular time in a particular place for a particular reason. What's great about that is we often think about and paint the antiquity with broad brushstrokes. Like we'll see here, pagans said this, or pagans believed that. And we wouldn't do that today. No one today would say Americans believe this about the coronavirus, because there's the gamut of opinions, for example. And so we need to make sure we don't do that with antiquity. And so inscriptions allow us to see that there were regional variations. It allows us to reconstruct the calendars, because every city had its own calendar with its own pantheon. There were the 12, the major 12 Olympian gods, but there are different manifestations of them, and there are different ones that people would have as their patron deity. Inscriptions allow us to reconstruct those. They allow us to reconstruct customs and laws of these specific cities. And most of these cities have been excavated, the ones that are associated with earliest Christianity. So they're really an untapped resource for figuring out and interpreting the earliest Christian documents. And so that's part of what I do, is preach the good news about, let's use these texts to look over and comb through the New Testament to see if we can, figure things out a little bit better, come to a better reconstruction of what was going on in first century Christianity.
And in terms of, I guess, if you want to say the social level of people that we're connecting with in terms of subscription or inscriptions, I'm going to get that word right eventually. You have a person kind of commissioning an inscription, an artisan or somebody skilled who might create the inscription, and then there's an audience for who it's intended for. I would expect a lot of inscriptions tend to be political or religious in nature. So, like in terms of like the sphere or level of society, like whose world are we getting a window into?
So that's another great part about inscriptions that I should have mentioned. So thank you for bringing that up. They're just so diverse because it sort of runs the gamut of social classes in the first century world. You have those official inscriptions that are set up by governments, local governments, imperial governments. These would have used the best resources available. They usually have something to do with the official running of the city in some way, shape, or form. They usually have a commemorative function. These would not, rather get that right myself, be considered there's a word, that an archive that I was looking for. Thank you. These wouldn't be considered archives because these cities had archives. These would be things that people set up that they wanted future generations to read. And then there are what we would call like private inscriptions. These are ones that private individuals commission, and these are so diverse. Sometimes we'll have the elite of elite who commission inscriptions, and they'll commission inscriptions for the tomb, for example, and it'll be massive. It'll be, they're using the best resources available, and they spell out every political office that they held, every single thing they could boast about. And then you'll also have these artisans who set up inscriptions. people who were innkeepers, people who just did menial tasks. And so you really get everything in between. You get slaves mentioned in inscriptions. They set up inscriptions, freed persons. You'll see wives, you'll see husbands, you'll see children. And so it really gives us a fuller portrait of what was going on in the first century. And it gives us sources that we just don't, and perspectives rather, we just don't find in the Greco-Roman literature, which most of which that survives was written by men. And so they're really concerned with things that men are concerned about. And so we get a fuller picture, a more vibrant picture of what life was like in the first century with inscriptions.
Now, for this kind of middle part or kind of the meat of the interview, we might say, let's get into a little bit of context from some of the chapters in the book. I'd love to have you talk next about chapter two, where you look at inscriptions and local customs. Talk to us about some of the ground you cover there.
Yeah. So what I try to do in my book is to show how inscriptions can illuminate the world of the first Christians. And so I looked at sort of problems that scholars have argued about, and particularly in chapter two, I looked at Christology, so what the first Christians believed about Jesus. There was a debate that raged from the early 20th century all the way up until about our time. It's kind of, there's a consensus now, but in the early and sort of mid 20th century, there was a really famous movement called the History of Religion School. And basically, it said that anything, any divinity that could be attributed to Jesus happened not on Palestinian soil amongst the first Jewish Christians, because they were very rigidly monotheistic in their beliefs, but it had to happen on pagan soil. And so that was that view. There's a view that rose up in against that view, which is sort of the, I would say, the consensus now, which says that no, that's not correct. All of the evidence that the History of Religion School used, number one, it dates to the second and third century, so it's later than development of early Christianity. And if we really look at how diverse Palestine was, and we really look at how diverse monotheism was within Judaism, we can see that all of the elements are there for what we know as Christology, the belief that Jesus was divine. Well, no one had really looked at inscriptions in this argument to figure out what light they could shed on the topic. And so I just went through, because the main one of the arguments revolved around the kurios title, which is the Greek word for Lord, and whether or not Jesus was called Lord on Palestinian soil or on pagan soil, basically. And so no one had really gone back and looked at the inscriptions. And so I went back and I looked at Greek, Aramaic, Hebrew, and a few other Semitic languages that are very, very similar to Hebrew and Aramaic, to see what they said about the issue, what they called were their use of Lord, what we would translate as Lord. And I discovered that Lord was a title that was often attributed to a king in the first century BCE all the way to the first century CE, only in the southern Levant. So that would be Palestine and also in Egypt. And so I was able to make the argument that I'm not trying to say that Jesus wasn't divine. I think the first Christians thought that he was, but that what these texts really help us to see is that this is the only part of the world in which kurios was used for a king. It spreads later, around 70 CE, into the rest of the Roman Empire. And so it seems most likely to me that when the first Christians were calling Jesus Lord, that they were doing it, number one, in the southern Levant, in Palestine, and in Egypt, but that their focus on it was not necessarily Jesus' divinity, but the fact that Jesus was king, which is the fulfillment of the Psalms, right? You have this idea in Psalm 110:1, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand, until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. And all throughout 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. In the Old Testament, the king is just called Lord. And so I argued that, given the inscriptions, that Lord is really a royal title. And that's how we should understand it best. And we think about how the first Christians used it.
Well, next, let's jump into some of the ground you cover in chapter 5. There, you talk about inscriptions and their insights into the religious lives of women in the Roman world. I feel like when we get into some of the ancient Near Eastern context sorts of discussions, we don't always hear as much about women. So, what sorts of insights can we get into the religious lives of women in that time?
So all scholars have noticed that when it comes to the letter to the Philippians and it comes to Acts 16, that we know more women from the Philippian church than we do of any other church in the New Testament. And so it's one of the first places that scholars who want to focus on what women were doing in the New Testament world go to try to figure that out. And so what scholars have said is that, well, we obviously have more women doing more things in the church of Philippi because we know that Macedonian culture allowed women to do more things than Greek culture. Well, that's not really the case here because technically Philippi that Paul evangelized would not have been considered Macedonian soil. It was a Roman colony. And so what one of the great benefits of inscriptions is inscriptions, like I said, they were diverse. Some of them were not composed by elite men. And so they provide windows into what women were doing in the first century. So I thought, well, let's go back and let's look at the inscriptions from Philippi to see if they can shed light on what Euodia and Syntyche, who are mentioned in Philippians chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, and Lydia, who's mentioned in Acts chapter 16, verses 11 through 40, what they might have been doing in the Philippian church. And so when we do that, we see that, number one, that women had a prominent position in the Roman colony of Philippi. They were benefactresses. And so their statues were erected. The largest monument that has been discovered in Philippi was a monument dedicated to 7 women who were priestesses of deified Augusta, which is Augustus's wife. And so they're very prominent in Philippi. Once you go to the religious, the social, the political heart of the city, the biggest monument you saw was one to 7 priestesses. And then I was able to look and see in other inscriptions, we have women who are priestesses in sort of co-ed cults, which means that they had some authority over those particular men who were within those cults. And then I was able to find other inscriptions, one of which that scholars really hadn't used, that talked about how there was this one lady who had this office of an antistes in Latin. This is where my Latin background really helped, because as a Roman colony, Philippi, most of the inscriptions from the Roman period are in Latin and not Greek. And so this Latin word antistes is a special word that's typically used for someone who speaks on behalf of a deity, someone who cares for the deity's house. As a matter of fact, later on, Latin-speaking Christians will use that word for a bishop. And so it's a pretty exalted role. And so we know from an inscription there was a lady in Philippi who was one of these. She was an antistes, which meant that she spoke on behalf of the deity. She cared for the deity's cult. She had a leading role. And so when I looked at all of that information alongside of what Lydia was doing in Acts chapter 16, along the fact that you have Euodia and Syntyche who Paul singles out. He doesn't usually make a habit of singling out people within his letters. So these must have been 2 prominent Christians in the church in Philippi. I made the case that these 2 ladies were probably deacons, and they could have been what we would call overseers, and that Lydia was no doubt a benefactress of the church, just like those other ladies were benefactresses in Philippi.
And let's jump now into chapter 6. I feel like one of the places we can really struggle when we look at scriptures with numbers, like we often don't realize significance of numbers. So talk to us about how studying inscriptions can help us get through some of those muddy kind of exegetical impasses.
Yeah, so that was one of the things I want to highlight in that particular chapter, is that oftentimes scholars are just befuddled about something, and we can't figure out what the answer is to this question or even make a good case for anything. And so That's usually because we're only playing with half a deck of cards, or maybe a third of a deck of cards, if you want to think about how many inscriptions that there are. And so what I did was I looked at this old discussion that's been happening now for about 100 years about how to think about the number of the beast, 666. And you have people who say, well, this is symbolic. This means, the trifecta of evil because 7 is perfect. And you have other people who say, well, given the fact that Greeks did not have a number system and that letters pulled a double duty and they function as numbers, and that we have inscriptions, mainly graffiti. These would be messages that were scratched on walls or engraved on walls that weren't meant to last for forever. We just happened to find them now, so it's by God's grace that we have them. But there were 2 inscriptions from Pompeii that said something to the effect of "I love the girl whose number is 545." And so you had these 2 groups that saying, well, this is sort of this larger, that John, the author of the book of Revelation, is participating in disguising the beast's name with a number like these graffiti from Pompeii. Other people saying, well, this is symbolic. Well, so what I did is I just went back and I said to myself, here are 2 cases of this from inscriptions. Are there any more? So I began to look, and I found 21 other cases where people had disguised someone's name with numbers. Some of those were found in the latter part of the 20th century, and then we have an archaeological context for them. And that's super important because we can tell more about when it was written, the circumstances under which it was written, to whom it was written. Some of these are from cities to whom the book of Revelation was written, like Ephesus and Smyrna. Now they date sort of into the 1st century CE, beginning of the 1st century or the 2nd century CE, but they're really close in time period. And these show that disguising the name of someone with numbers, it was just a cross-cultural phenomenon. So I was able to show that we have someone from Italy, we have a couple from Greece, we have a lot from Asia Minor, and they all sort of have this same formula. And so this was what I call a pan-Mediterranean formula that people use, that people would have known. And so then I went and I looked at, well, because one of the things that these inscriptions, when we find them, we know the context for them, it's really clear that these types of inscriptions are for insiders, and that these people know who is being identified by the number, because there's one graffito that says, I love the girl whose number is 545. I forgot exact number, so don't hold me to that. And the one who loved her, his number is 675. If you can solve the riddle, please do so. Well, we know someone did, because a second hand and a different hand comes in and solves the riddle. So obviously these people could solve these number games. And so what I argued in that particular chapter is that John is participating in the same sort of number game. And then he provides all of the information that his audience needs to connect it to the Emperor Nero, whose name, when spelled in a Semitic spelling, and there's the catch, Semitic spelling of it, is 666.
Fascinating. Fascinating. I think that might be, for me, that was probably the most important chapter of the book in terms of some of the places we get off the rails, how we interpret numbers
Right.
that we encounter in scripture. If you think of like the overall journey of the reader with the book, when they get to the last page, like how do you hope you've impacted them? Like what's that one thing you hope you've opened every reader's eyes up to?
So I hope that they see the importance of inscriptions, number one. And I hope they're encouraged to read more inscriptions. There are, like I said, 500,000 to 800,000 inscriptions. Not all of them have been translated into English, but a lot of them have. And you can pick up a lot of these on Amazon. There are these wonderful things called source books that they're just inscriptions that have been translated. And any inscription is insight into the world in which the first Christians lived. And so I hope people see that one inscription is worth more than what 10,000 commentators have to say about a particular biblical passage.
And you've already kind of alluded to this a little bit, but I'll still ask, beyond your book, are there any other additional tools, resources? If somebody reads your book and says, man, I really want to go deeper, what would you recommend as 1 or 2 follow-up resources?
Yeah. So if depending on if they had any knowledge of Greek and Latin, if they did, then I would point them to Brian McLean's uh, magisterial book on Greek inscriptions. It's Greek epigraphy from death of Alexander the Great until Constantine the Great. And then I would direct them to the Oxford Handbook of Roman Epigraphy, which is all about Latin. If they didn't, there are great tools. The British Museum has published two small books, but they're very deep as well as being small. One is by, I think, Dooms, Dooms, and the other is by Cook. One is Greek inscriptions, the other is Latin inscriptions. That'll give you, that's a more of an introduction to inscriptions. And then I would just encourage them to go and to find these source books or anthologies of inscriptions. John Kloppenborg, Phil Harland, and Richard Askoff, they've translated a ton of inscriptions that are associated with associations. And you can buy, there's a wonderful little book that is just the English translations of those. I think it's put out by Baylor Press. It just associates them to the Greco-Roman world. That's one example. There's a series, documents from the Greek and Roman world, I think is the title of it. There's like 6 in the series. They're older, in the 70s and 80s, and they are published by Cambridge University Press. You can get them pretty cheap on Amazon. And then the other place I tell them to go is Michael Austin, The Hellenistic World, which is a massive book that contains numerous inscriptions, but also some literary sources. And the final book that I tell them to go to is Roman Civilization. It's a 2-volume work by Meyer and Reinhold, I think are the names. And so one is on the Roman Empire and one is on the Roman Republic. It's not just inscriptions, but there are a lot of inscriptions in there.
Well, thank you for such a broad additional reading list. I appreciate that. I'll be sure to include links in the show notes for all the books mentioned during the conversation today. And Clint, in terms of people finding out more about you, connecting with the book, and any other work that you've done, where are some of the places we can discover you on the web?
So you can go to my website, clintburnett.com. I'm on Twitter at dclintburnett, but I think it's like dclintburnett1 or something like that. And I'm also on Facebook. You can send me an email, davidclintburnett@gmail.com. I'll respond if you have any questions. And I also started teaching a course on inscriptions and the New Testament on Zoom for anyone who wants to take it. Something that I'm offering right now, and I'll re-offer it again in the fall. It's 16 weeks, but it's only 8 class meetings, and we just get together and we just read inscriptions and we just talk about how they relate to the New Testament, and it's a wonderful experience.
And like we do with the show notes, we'll have detailed links, places where you can connect with Clint, pick up your copy of his book, and some of the other resources we mentioned throughout the conversation. It's time to bring this episode of the Shaun Tabatt Show to a close. Many thanks for being a part of my conversation with Clint Burnett. Once again, our book today was Studying the New Testament Through Inscriptions, an Introduction. If you'd like to find out more, a great place to start is Clint's website. You can find that over at clintburnett.com. Otherwise, pick up your very own copy of his new book on Amazon or wherever great books are sold. And Clint, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing with us today. It's been an honor. It's been a fascinating journey having you on the show.
Thank you very much.